Hi guys, and welcome to Node Better. This is the first episode, and will probably end up being a little rough. Hopefully, I'll improve as we move along. But hopefully, regardless, you guys will learn something. Today, that something is basically how Express middleware works. So, you've probably seen Express setups that look similar to this. Um, you'll see these little app.use where you have what documentation describes as middleware. Um, so you may be interested to learn that the order of these middlewares matters, and the order is determined by what order they are literally called with this app.use. Um, so what are they? How do they work? What are they doing? Um, well, each one's a little different, but effectively, each middleware is basically just a function which takes three parameters. The first is the request object, second is the response object, and the third is what we call next, which is just a function callback saying, hey, I'm done, let's go to the next piece of middleware. Um, you'll see two different formats of middleware injection. So one is this app.use where you're passing this, and this applies to all routes regardless of path. You'd also use the path version. Now, this is actually the equivalent of that in that I've passed the path as being slash, which means if the path includes anything which is included in a slash, it's basically the same thing. So these two statements are equivalent, but you could put anything here. I mean, you could put slash, that this only applies to images, and only if a path includes that will it be processed. Now, interestingly, this is not so much a middleware as it is a route handler. So let's go take a look at it. If we take a look at this guy, we'll see that we are requiring the express router up here. And down here, you'll see that we have a router.get for the path slash. Now you'll notice here between the path and the function, where we're actually doing our route logic for rendering response, we have this thing called permanent cache. And this is actually an express middleware as well. And so you can actually inject as many middlewares here as you'd like. I mean, you can do middleware 2 here, and it'll call that as well before it ever gets to the main function. So we're going to use this permanent cache as a way of showing you how all middleware works in Express. And it's defined up here. You'll see it takes a request object, a response object, and a next function, just like we talked about. And what this function is basically doing is caching any response that we send so that we don't have to render the template again. This could be good for if you are trying to just make your static assets load faster, like if your landing page is just takes a little while to render. I mean, or if you just don't want to allocate resources to doing a page render every time somebody hits your landing page in a large-scale application, you may want to store the rendered HTML in memory, and this is a good way of doing that. So up here we've defined a static HTML object, which we are at the very beginning going to check to see if it contains a value at the key of rec route path. Now, rec route path is basically the path of the current request. And in this example, this would just be slash if we were hitting, mysite.com. It would just be slash in this box, which means we're just looking for a static HTML where the key is slash. And if this HTML comes back with a value, we would continue into this logic and just respond with that value. Now, if we don't, we continue on, and we actually are going to intercept the res.send function. Now, if you aren't familiar, res.send is the express function which is used to send data to the client and into the connection. This is usually called with some sort of data. It might be JSON, it might be HTML, and in this case, even when you call res.render down here, what will actually end up happening is it will render the template with the given variables, and then it will res.send that string of HTML down to the client. Now what we're doing here, since we copy the existing res.send into kind of a holding variable of real send, and then we override the res.send function with our own. And here we're just storing the HTML that was passed, or whatever data was passed to res.send, and we're just storing that in our static HTML cache here. And then we're calling real send on this data. So you'll see this middleware, all it does is it checks to see if the HTML is there. If it is, it sends it back to the client. If it's not, it adds this little send intercept, and then it calls next. So on the very first request to this router, or when this router path endpoint it will call this middleware. It'll check the cache. Nothing will exist. So it'll add this intercept, and then it'll call next. And that means that it calls this function with the newly modified response object. So when res.render completes and calls res.send, it'll actually end up calling this function, and will then cache our route. And on the next request, this HTML will exist, and we can just send back the HTML, and this will never be called. There's a lot of middleware out there, and you should understand what it's doing before you just throw it at the top of your stack, because you may be calling a bunch of middleware unnecessarily before certain paths. Like for example, you'll notice that I put a cookie parser down below where we're doing our static assets, because we may not care to bother our session store on every single request for some picture that's on the main site. That's especially if you're using like a database-based session store. That means it's going to have to do a read on every single static asset request if this middleware was up here. So think about where you put your middleware in the stack. Think about where your routes are handled in the stack. You'll notice here I didn't even care if the index page got cookies. Because they're not logged in, for the most part, cookies don't matter at this point. If there was some sort of interactive content, then cookies might be useful to have above this step. But if you know you don't need something, try and put it lower in the middleware stack. This will improve performance. This will make things a lot easier to debug later on. Now, if you're feeling fancy, now that you kind of understand what middleware is doing, you could try building your own. So we could make something simple like a function test rec res next as necessary, and we can just console.log hello world. And naturally we need to call next, so that it'll call our next piece. So if you want, you can just place it down here, and if you run this and you're using all the same little things that I'm using here, what you'd see is on the first request it would say hello world, but then on the second request, because this permanent cache here would intercept the request, you'd actually never see this hello world again. Now hopefully you guys learned something. Hopefully I'll keep making these videos, and see you guys next time.